Hey, it's Reece, and this is how to change the strut bladder on an Ocean Rodeo wing. If you don't have an Ocean Rodeo wing, you can still use most of this technique for another brand. In order to do this bladder change, you're going to need 2 pieces of line longer than the strut of the wing. I suggest using fishing line. I didn't have any, so I'm going to use kite line. The first thing you're going to do is take out the carbon handles or whatever handles you have on your wing. Just makes it easier to work with the strut. Go up to where the strut connects to the leading edge of the wing, and there's going to be a little piece of line connected to a little webbing loop, and there'll be 2 of them. You're going to want to untie those lines. Once you've untied the line, you're going to tie it to one of the 2 longer pieces of line that you have with you. Repeat the process with the second piece of line, tying your second line to this one. When the 2 bladder tethers are tied off to your pieces of line, it's time to push the inflation valve for the strut inside of the airframe. It's just Velcroed on. The next step is to detach the Velcro on the end of the strut. And what you're going to do here is just reach in with your finger and kind of work the Velcro off. There's a decent amount of Velcro in there. It might take you a second to get all of it detached. Once you've detached all the Velcro, you can pull the tip of the strut out and expose the bladder inside. Next, I lay the strut out flat because we're going to be pulling the bladder out of the strut. One thing you're going to want to do if you're on your own is you're going to want to weigh down the leading edge side of the wing so that as you're pulling the bladder out, it's not going to be pulling the wing with it. So that's what I'm doing with this little metal table thing. I'm just weighing down the wing so that I can pull the bladder out. The next thing you're going to hit is the inflation valve. And so you will have to reach in with your fingers and squeeze the valve into a C shape in order to pull it out of the end of the strut. You've now removed the bladder completely, and you just need to untie the knots. It's important not to cross these 2 lines. If you cross those lines, you could end up with a twisted bladder inside of your boom. Next thing I do is get the bladder laid out nice and flat, the new bladder laid out nice and flat, and I fold it over itself like this. You want to connect the 2 tethers to the same lines that they were on before. Make sure that the bladder is not upside down. So in this case, my bladder came out with the valve facing up, so I'm going to do the same thing. When you're done tying the tethers to the lines, go and lay the strut out flat with the valve opening facing upwards. And now start pulling the bladder back through. So at the beginning here, you're going to have to go back and forth a couple times. You've noticed that I've put the metal table on the trailing edge of the wing now, and that's so that I can weigh down that trailing edge and pull the bladder through without pulling the wing with it. So you want to work the valve back through again. You kind of have to squeeze it into a C shape again and try and not get the bladder all wrapped around it. This process is much easier with two people, so you have one person pulling the bladder through and the other person feeding it into the opening of the strut. Once the valve is through, you can continue to pull the rest of the bladder into the strut until you hit the end of your tethers, and then you're going to want to pull the tether line back through the holes. So it should look like this at the end. Your tether line should be back out, exposed on the outside of the wing, back through the same holes that they were in before. Untie the tethers and retie them back onto the webbing loops. Locate the inflation valve inside of the strut, and you want to reconnect it to the Velcro so that it is popping through like before. The main thing to think about here is not to get the bladder pinched between the Velcro while you're reinstalling the inflation valve. And the final step is to close off the end of the strut. So you want to push the excess bladder into the strut until you reach the weld line on the tip of the bladder. Then you're going to fold the bladder over the piece of material that's sticking out of the strut. Inflate the strut slowly and lightly. Do not put much pressure into it. Here you are just inspecting the strut to make sure the bladder is all lined up okay and there's no warping or twisting. And if all of those are looking good, so there's no weird crinkles or twists in the bladder, you're pretty much good to go. You can put your handles back on and hit the water.